Hey everyone, welcome to CDT's working group call. This call is going to be about work in civil society on technical standards, specifically internet standards and human rights. Before I do an introduction, I wanted to make sure everyone was aware of the um, terms of this call. So we will, in fact, use the Chatham House rule to make sure everyone feels comfortable asking questions and receiving answers. However, we wanted to record the first portion of this. So note that the recording is now on. We'll keep it on until all of our panelists have delivered their introductory remarks and had a bit of presentation. And then we will be leaving time for questions, at which point we will turn off the recording so that we can observe the Chatham House rule. And I'll remind you of that soon. So I wanted just to welcome you on behalf of CDT. I'm Mallory Nodal. I'm the chief technologist at CDT, and working on internet standards is a really core function of my work. I'm also joined at CDT by Jamal Magby, who is our community engagement specialist at CDT. So he's helping me run things. I'm really grateful to have him. Also, Nick Doty is here as well, somebody who works a lot on standards in addition to that. So we have invited some folks from beyond CDT, our core partners in this work, who I think will really give everyone a picture of how this field has expanded over time. While CDT was maybe one of the first to engage in standards bodies back in 2001, John Morris, who was at CDT at the time, started going to Internet Engineering Task Force meetings. And we've sort of maintained that posture in the IETF, as well as the World Wide Web Consortium and several other standards bodies that you might be looking up the acronyms for throughout this call. So apologies in advance. But in that time, we've also been joined by several core partners in civil society who've begun to engage or have been engaging for some time. So Gershabad Grover is here from Article 19. We also have Michaela Nakayama Shapiro from Global Partners Digital, and we have Stephanie Borg-Salia from Diplo Foundation. So we're super excited to have a more rounded conversation than just CDT talking about what it's doing, even though that work is pretty extensive. Once you get the bigger picture, it becomes even more impressive. So with that, I don't want to take up more time for intros. I want to really get into it so we can hear from everybody. I have a few questions for you all after you do a sort of 5-minute intro into what your organization is doing on tech standards and human rights. And then we'll close the recording and get into the Q&A after that. But throughout, though, folks who are here to watch and listen, please do engage by, you can drop questions into the chat or just get ready to ask them either on microphone or on camera at that time. So queue up those curiosities. I'm going to turn it over to Gershabad first. So Gershabad, yeah, just kick us off by talking a little bit about Article 19's history in this field and what you're currently working on.
Thank you, Mallory. Pleasure to be here. And yes, so Article 19 is a human rights organization, and we focus on freedom of expression and access to information. And the underlying framework of our engagement has always been, and hopefully will continue to be, international human rights, including the UDHR, the ICCPR. And the focus is on bringing human rights considerations to information and communication technology at large, but technical standards in particular. Our focus areas include, first, encouraging universal and meaningful connectivity, and that means expanding internet access to those who don't have it, fighting net neutrality violations where people do have access, and also encouraging small and community internet service providers. Our second project is surveillance and censorship, and there we try to reduce the scope and extent of personal information that is available to private companies, private ICT companies, and by extension, often to state actors. Third is our datafication program, which focuses on data-intensive technologies, especially those using artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques. And here, in the recent past, our focus has been on biometric tech, especially facial and emotional surveillance and recognition. Um, I guess our strategy across these standards bodies is informed by the fact that they are dominated by industry and sometimes, depending on the forum, also state actors. And um, if I had to classify sort of our activities into four prongs, the first would be research to excavate the link between human rights and these technical standards. The second is, of course, engagement itself, where um, on the meta level, sort of push for organizational change, push for standards bodies to have a systemized way to analyze the impact or the potential impact of the technical standards that are being worked on. Second, I guess, is to prevent the standardization of technologies that are inherently and essentially incompatible with the exercise of human rights. And from our perspective in the recent past, that has meant emotional recognition in particular. Um, and or real-time biometric surveillance, especially in policing and migration. Third, I think for particular standards, we try to push that these documents and specifications acknowledge the risk of standardized technologies where um, we aren't able to prevent such applications. And um, lastly, if technical change is not possible in these standards, I think there's always scope for including sort of policy or operational controls in these standards that can mitigate the impact on human rights. Um, so yeah, all on I guess a third sort of prong of the strategy is we also partner with civil society organizations, and in particular, we have fellowships and different programs to build capacity in civil society to engage at these fora. Lastly, I think particularly close to my heart is just communication about what we do. As one of the journalists I admire, Ravish Kumar, said, not all battles are fought for victory. Some are fought to tell the world that there was someone on the battlefield. And we are in an uphill battle. Sorry to continue on that metaphor, but we're doing specialized work. As I said, these forums are industry dominated. So I personally feel it's very important to just be recording and documenting as much of our work as we can, and that includes breaking down the human rights implications of particular standards, and wherever possible, also listing down what company, advocated for what position, so that we have this useful history in the future as well. I hope that wasn't too abstract, but I'm happy to talk about specifics later as well. Thank you.
No, it was great. And thank you for giving such a broad overview in such a short amount of time. I know that's not easy, but we'll come back to more questions to allow you to expand a bit. So Stephanie, I wanted to turn to you. Now, I know your work is a bit new, but we're really excited to hear what you're planning and to see that Diplo is entering the space.
Thanks so much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Yeah, latest project that we have is fairly new, but the flows work is quite old. So in terms of ages, Diplo is no longer a teenager, but is an adult. We're 20, close to 21 years old. So we've been quite a little bit in the scene, and our focus is digital policy and diplomacy mostly, but a lot of us focus actively on digital policy. And what we do basically is analyze the policy developments across a wide area of thematic issues, so across a taxonomy of issues, and we try to dissect it, analyze it. One of our target audiences is the diplomatic community, but also we train stakeholders from across the board. And in fact, capacity development is one of the main areas that we have been working on for a long time. When it comes to standardization, for instance, we
Stephanie, sorry, your connection is a little unstable. We're having a hard time hearing you right now.
Oh, I'm very sorry about that. How about, is it stable now?
It's better now. Yeah, it's going in
It's
and out.
better now.
Yeah, if you had another network you could connect to, that might help. But if not, don't worry.
I do have another network. I can try that.
Okay.
Hi, sorry about that.
That's all
Let's
right.
see how this goes. If I drop again, I have my colleague here, Pavlina, my colleague in based in Washington, who can take over. So basically, what Diplo does is capacity development and research. Right? And in research, we have specific research related to standardization processes. I'll jump very quickly to the latest project that we're dealing with, and that's it's called CADE. It's an EU-funded project, so it's funded by the European Commission, by DG INSPA, and the main aim is to bring civil society closer to digital policy processes. And I'll now dig deep. So when it comes to civil society, we're targeting mostly civil society from the global south. And when it comes to the processes, we're interested mainly, or let's say, we're trying to bring civil society closer mainly to the processes of the ITU, IETF, ICANN, IGF, and some other processes on related to the work. So standardization is one of the issues that we would like civil society to be focused more closely on. And we're actually a consortium of 10 partners. So it's not just Diplo, Diplo is just the lead, but there are partners from Europe, from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, all with excellent networks, with excellent civil society networks. And the project has just started, so now we're literally pooling together networks, resources, our expertise to find out or to make sure that we really know what the problems are when it comes to participation, meaningful participation in these processes, and literally tackle those problems. So whether it is related to developing the capacities, whether it is related to literally hand holding civil society participate in these processes, or if it's a matter of network. So we have various tracks, but the first step is for us to really gain a very good understanding of what the issues are that are preventing civil society. We do have an indication, but obviously we want to really make sure by asking civil society organizations in the global south what the limitations are, what the problems are, and then we tackle those things specifically. So that's the project in a nutshell.
Great.
Thank you, Mallory. That's you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. And by the end, your connection was pretty good. So yeah, thanks for that. So Michaela, I'm going to turn to you now. You also, following on from both Stephanie and Gershabad, work in a consortium with partners on this as well. So we'd love to hear the work that you're doing that I think is in its final stretch, kind of, right? You've been doing it for about a couple of years now. It's exciting. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. We're in the final stretch, although we're hoping that it won't be the final stretch. We're hoping to continue this work. So definitely would be great to connect Stephanie, because I think especially, and I know we've worked with Article 19 and CDT in this area. So maybe in terms of kind of age and engaging in this space, maybe we're the toddler slash teenager in terms of we've been engaging in this work for roughly kind of the past 2 to 3 years, and we've learned so much from partners, other civil society organizations such as Article 19 and CDT, who have been doing this work for a while. So yeah, it would be great to connect Stephanie after this call and talk more about your project. It sounds super relevant. I would say kind of our angle in terms of getting started in the technical standards space, we started with the framing of internet fragmentation, which I won't bore anyone on going into too much detail on that, but one of the key elements that came out of discussions through the IGF's policy network on the topic is that the technical underpinnings of the internet are something that need to be protected, and in terms of and ensuring that it continues to be secure, interoperable, and open, we ensure that human rights are being protected both offline and online. So that was kind of the underlying premise that started getting us started in this work. And as Mallory mentioned, we have been implementing a project specifically on engagement at technical standard setting bodies since the fall of 2022. And that project, as Mallory mentioned, we're working with partners based around the world. So we have partners in Brazil, as well as Nigeria, Kenya, and as well as in Malaysia and the Philippines. So we've really benefited from having that kind of regional perspective. And so part of the project is both trying to identify what threats there could be to an open interoperable internet and how civil society can kind of work to counter those threats as well. And that's also coupled with the actual engagement itself, which we're looking at very similar forums to those on the call. So we're prioritizing ICANN, the IETF, and the ITU. And essentially the project, in addition to kind of looking at that lens of the regional perspectives, it's also, and a common thread I've already seen from our discussion is capacity building. I think that might be the key word of today is really working with civil society partners to be able to have the expertise and kind of ability to navigate these spaces, which each have very different personalities, very different roles of working, and can at times feel very inaccessible. But the angle that we're working through is that standards can no longer be something that are kind of kept within a very small community. They impact end users everywhere. We almost, a good number of us use the internet every day. And as Gershabad mentioned, those who don't, that's important to continue building that accessibility. But at the moment, our priority is really working with civil society partners, developing resources and kind of providing trainings and ways to ensure that that engagement can take place and to bring in, kind of open these spaces, bring in more perspectives to this process that it can no longer be siloed. So that's really kind of the perspective that we're bringing at this point. And that's also operating under the assumption that there is a unique value add that civil society brings to these processes. And so through that perspective, the idea is to raise awareness of why civil society and among other stakeholder groups should be paying attention to these issues, which might not sound super exciting at first and can seem a little hard to get into, but there is a real significance to understanding this topic beyond just engineers. And I do not have an engineering background, so I'm also very much part of that group that is learning how to understand these topics and to make informed inputs. So maybe for now, I can just go very quickly through kind of the forums that we're looking at. So we're looking at the International Telecommunications Union, specifically the telecommunications. We're kind of looking at the standardization assembly that's coming up this year. IETF, we're looking at a number of different working groups and research groups. And in ICANN, a lot of that work is really about raising awareness of the relevance of internet fragmentation and kind of potential risks that it could bring to ICANN's mandate. And maybe I'll just pause there. And I know there was a lot there already. So thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, it was good. I had planned a little game where I was going to try to expand all the acronyms and have you all raise your hands if you're engaging in the fora, but you went through you gave us a good start. So IETF, ITU, and ICANN. Gershabad and Stephanie, are you also engaging in either of in any of those three? Gershabad, do you want to go first?
Yes, at the IETF, I think one of the sort of achievements in the past and with a lot of effort from you, Mallory, has been the human rights protocol considerations research group at the Internet Research Task Force. So slightly different, but the agenda there was to establish this link between technical standards and human rights. And these have sort of evolved into RFCs, and that are sometimes used by the community to analyze either protocols, network protocols in development, or those that have already been deployed for their human rights impact. In terms of working groups, I think a large part of the focus in the last few years has been looking at developments that minimize the amount of personal information that's available to network intermediaries and subsequently states. So in particular, the domain name system, DNS, and advances in transport layer security, TLS, and the associated HTTPS standards. And there, at the ITF, of course, there are corporate forces that are sometimes aligned with this vision. And so a lot of the thrust has come from them as well. I would say that most of these issues, when framed by the industry, especially American companies and or sort of American libertarians that are at the ITF, have been in terms of combating state surveillance and um, for privacy, but and often those are directly overlapping with concerns of censorship as well. But I think we are beginning to sort of also highlight that distinction in the case of particular standards. I think the upcoming work um, will sort of focus on new stuff that we still have to decide whether belongs in the ITF or not, including on um, credentials on the internet and how they're shared and accessed. And um, Corey is here, who was a fellow with Article 19, also looking at whether these privacy enhancing technologies sort of lead to more consolidation in the market. And now there's new work on detecting unwanted location trackers, etc. So that's some small sample of like the current work that's going on at the ITF. At the ITU, I think Dr. Raquel Reno, my colleague, has been focusing at the ITU-T to look at how spectrum, especially, is assigned for traditional telecom companies, but also now the new entrants are, of course, Starlink, like satellite internet providers that create sort of a parallel host of concerns. And they're really I guess, throughout the history of the ITU, what has not received enough attention is both from a technical point of view and from a regulatory point of view, how do we encourage small and community networks that can, by design, reach the last mile, and rather than on these like um, command and control approaches that sell spectrum to big players at both at the national level, but like you see this reflected across these standards bodies and international forums as well.
And then I know too, we mentioned briefly the World Wide Web Consortium, where some of this overlaps and more of the verified credentials and ID work seems to be happening there than in the IETF, although some of these things bridge topics. Also the IEEE, this is where the pop quiz comes in, the Institute for Electronics and Electrical Engineers. I think that's right. It's a vast standards association. They standardize everything. And I think it's been our strategy in the past with Article 19 to look at the Wi-Fi standard. So the 8.2.11 work seems quite consequential for like that hardware layer and how defaults can be set in networks locally and those connected to the network. There's also work there that overlaps a bit with the Human Rights Protocol Considerations research group on intimate partner violence, that they're trying to standardize some formulation around how to mitigate those harms. And then lastly, I'll just mention at the IEEE, they are trying to deal with terminology that's more inclusive at the high level of the essay, but also in the Wi-Fi network. Let's see what else I wanted to ask. So I'm trying to dig deeper on some of these questions before we open it up. But I wondered if I could ask Stephanie your take maybe on the human rights, or the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, rather, put out a report in November to the Human Rights Council on emerging technologies and standards and the role of human rights. How is this factoring into the way that you are building capacity also with states to engage in standards as well as civil society? Like, have you given some thought to what this means for our space as it goes forward?
Thanks, Mallory. In terms of the project, I would say we're still at the start. So we started the implementation literally a couple of weeks ago. So we are at the stage of brainstorming with the partners to see what their work has been like and to really see which areas of the or which specific work of these multi-stakeholder multilateral processes, as the EU calls them, from which angle we are approaching them. So at the moment, we're still in a brainstorming phase. Yeah, we are aware of the work that the OHCHR is doing also on standardization and human rights, because in Geneva we are collaborating also with them, but it's also for them at the moment, our understanding is it's soul searching phase at the moment. So it's a bit early to have any, solid positions.
No, that's totally fair. And maybe I can ask Michaela as well, because Global Partners Digital does a lot on internet governance more broadly, and it's been sort of an extension and expansion of your work to get into standards, where it's almost like some of us are in the opposite position. It's like we started kind of working in standards, and now we're extending out, and we're seeing how this sort of standards work is really governance work that fits into the larger internet governance landscape. So I guess I wonder, like, if you have any hot takes on these really proactive proposals by the human rights community to get involved in standards, and part of that is the OHCHR report, but it's also like there's an ITU proposal by some member states to create a mechanism there. Like, just wondering if you're thinking about that too.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think I hadn't thought about it that way, but that has been our kind of foray into it because, yeah, GPT did not come in to this space kind of with a strong technical background. So we have been kind of starting from the point of what do we already know? And so we've been very active in the internet governance space, largely in the perspective of course, kind of from the overarching mission of promoting and protecting an open, interoperable, secure internet, as I mentioned before, but also to really kind of ensure that the multi-stakeholder model that underpins the internet continues to be kind of that pillar that continues to be the model, really, for lack of better wording. And so what does that mean, right? So we have this kind of broad constellation of spaces that are all discussing this topic, and it's only getting more, for at least in the time that I've been in this field, which is relatively short, especially compared to some of you who have been in here longer. But yeah, I feel like I've seen the topic of internet governance come up more and more, even in kind of current events, news, and discussions. The war in Ukraine, you had the request going to ICANN, I think it was ICANN, about the root server to shut it down in terms of to shut down Russia's access to the internet. And that was a particularly controversial moment in this space. And so I think for us, it's really been an exercise of connecting the dots. And so we think it's really important to have these spaces that, of course, we want to ensure that the spaces where the discussions on specifically technical standards continue to be the space that have those discussions. And of course, we want more actors to be involved from a number of stakeholder groups, but concurrently, we we also don't want to see necessarily there's a shift in discussions going to spaces that are more closed off. So it's a bit of kind of a two-pronged approach. You want the forums that are already discussing this to be more open to new actors and new perspectives, and similarly, we have seen kind of trends where some of the internet governance discussions are starting to bleed into spaces that are traditionally more closed off with civil society. So I think we're trying to take this macro level view, and what the OHCHR report does really well in our view is kind of break that down and provide some really tangible, concrete recommendations for how to address some of the challenges to this broader landscape. So for example, what GPT is doing through the project that we were just talking about is working with civil society groups to understand how these the pieces fit together. So if you want to discuss, this issue is being talked about here in this capacity and in this perspective, if you want to talk about it this way, here's, where the discussion is taking place. As I mentioned in the beginning, each of these standard setting bodies have a very different way of operating, a very different culture and a personality. Not to anthropomorphize SDOs, but I think in some ways that is kind of how it feels. But yeah, I think the OHCHR report also does a really fantastic job of just providing an entry point no matter what perspective you're coming in. So for someone like me with less of a technical background, it provides a really nice overview of the topic and concrete recommendations. If you have more of a technical background, it provides you that human rights angle that maybe isn't always quite so obvious. So I would say it's been really helpful in terms of kind of steering the direction of our work. And it was great to actually meet you in person in Geneva in the consultation for that report. So just really, yeah, really keen to I'm glad that others are also finding that report helpful.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, just I think one thing that I liked about the report is that it does treat this question of openness and access in direct ways, like, you have to be a certain member state or you have to be a paying member or things like that, which is a barrier, but it also puts those barriers alongside or next to the other barriers that exist that aren't so obvious, like the fact that you have to be really present and on mailing lists and in meetings that also have costs and that are inaccessible, and that you have to speak in English and you have all of these other things. Those are also barriers, even if the model we imagine is being open. So I know, Stephanie, you mentioned that's something that you're really worried, concerned about or looking into as far as your project goes, just like how we can lower all of those barriers, not just the really obvious material ones like exist at the ITU, for example. So with that, I'm not going to do any more closing remarks. We're going to stop the recording now and then move into questions. So I don't see any questions in the chat.